Esselamu Aleyküm.
Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Hopefully, our meeting will be fruitful. Jahannama Association has been working with a lot of effort, and we will try to contribute to it. With this session, with all of you participants, we had three speakers. However, Mr. Cameron Gökdağ was sent to another sessions because we have very significant speakers, so the speeches are not as heavy, and we are going to talk about politics with different dimensions. We are going to and we know, we all agree that we should look at its different dimension. When we say politics, people think of authorities being a determining factor, leading, guiding other people. However, politics includes authority. Yes, we need to have that approach. However, we also need to focus on justice without disregarding it. We need to manage this process of politics with that, and we need to carry this responsibility well, and we are going to look at different political worldviews. We have two speakers, two Hojas professors. Vahdettin Işık is going to talk about changing world and seek for a new language of Islamic movements, and Mehmet Akif Kayapınar Hoca is going to talk about an all-encompassing political order. Without further ado, I will give the floor to our speakers. We will, with Cameron Hoca participating in other sessions, we will have a lot of time to have your questions, comments, and we will have different perspectives. Firstly, I want to give the floor to Vahdettin Işık. I can give you microphone if you want. You can start. Good morning, everyone. I want to greet you all with respect. Today, as my friend mentioned, I'm going to talk about seek for a new language in terms of Islamic movements in a changing world, and we need to draw a framework, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I need to contextualize my speech. I want to first talk about the context that we exist in. I'm going to talk about Islamic history, and the framework is, as you see in this screen, it's with the revelation to the Hazreti Muhammad, and after he passed away with the Ibda age, and then as a reference point, and then Tadwin era with new civilizations. Today's age is similar to Tadwin age. In the Tadwin age, Muslims, after we lost our prophet, the Muslims were trying to adapt to new conditions, and they had a new language. That language is called the Tadwin century, and after that, in the 9th century until the 16th century, when we look at the global scale, we see that it is the authority age of Islam. Of course, this is not a political authority, but with scientific production and managing daily life with the institutions that it founded, it's a general age of authority. After the 17th century, without the occupation of Europe, there was a discourse about the things not going their way. Although this was a consensus among Muslims, this didn't receive as reciprocation from the society, and so the public, the masses, as well as ruling people in the states, they didn't realize the significance of this, and even the ones who did realize it after they realized it after a occupation of the West. We have an age, age of decline, age of defeat, that is 150 years. When we look at it, we see with the Vienna and Karlofça agreements, and we were in decline, although we had positions, and it was called the inhitat, the defeat age. So there was a lagging. I think it continued until 1924. Why? Because before of that there was a defeat too. There are a lot of immigrants, and our scientific production capacity needs to be restructured. And in that region there was an ibda age, meaning we need to build a new language and express those languages, just as the age of Tedwin. I think this was a first in the Muslim history. The problems we needed to face were Islam itself. There was such a challenge by the West, saying that Islam itself is going to be a problem of its own. So Islam on its own was going to be an obstacle in front of our advancement, and Muslims had a new language which was called Tejeddüt, which is the root of the modern Islam way of thinking, which was a renewal. This language had its own framework. The best example who expresses this framework is Said Halim Pasha. I'm going to talk about what he did very quickly. He had such a framework. He said it to us. Islam, he gave a definition of Islam and Islamification. Islam has its own itiqadiyat, or morality, faith and morality, and ijtimaiya, which is a rally, assembly, and after that there was a politics. And what is Islamification? He defined these as we need to look at the needs of the age, the time, the context, the place, the location, and we need to follow these steps fully, continuously, regarding the needs of the time and the location. So there was a need for a dynamism in fiqh. And in another Risale, he mentions that there needs to be a renewal in this fiqh, and he told that there was such a need. And his proposal was a framework, a political framework. After, in the background of that proposal was to build a new language. I believe the first one in the beginning of 20th century. There are three main arguments with 5 things that are accepted. So we either need to renew ourselves and continue, or we are going to diminish. So we had a new search of a new language because of that. And how do we build that new language with the conditions of the era? There were 2 extreme proposals. One is to have a protectionist approach, to go to the traditions, hold on to them very tightly, and the second was to be real, to not fool yourself, and it was thought that we need to follow the Western approaches. And the first one was either tahaffuz or tahavvul, which means we need to protect some things and we need to change some things. That offer included, we need to find if there's an imperialist as exploitative politics, and we need to have a language that is going to be an anti-imperialism, and it needs to be in its economic, administrative, political, and intellectual sense. As you see on the screen, it needs to be a holistic, independent fight for independence, of self-defense, and we needed to. And the second proposal is not by only the Islamic people, but it's the Islamic unity. We need Islamic unity, otherwise we cannot manage this. One country on its own cannot do this. We need to go solve the conflicts within Muslims with the micro framework. We need to have a common ideal. We need to go over our internal conflicts, and we need to bring those experiences and knowledge together, and we need to have a wall of resilience in front of that challenge. I mean, the third one is, of course, we need to renew ourselves, otherwise we would perish. What does that mean? Are we going to leave our roots? This is the second proposal of Babanzade Ahmet Naim Efendi. He said we need to focus, explore the old before finding new things or new proposals. So we need to have our base understanding of Islam in general, and we needed to look at the generations that came before us. We needed to look at their accumulation of knowledge, and we need to analyze them. Both of them are called treasures, or we don't care about tradition. That's not the problem here. We need to look at the treasure of the past, and we need to also connect and have a bridge to modernity. We need to benefit from the accumulated knowledge, and tajdid and renewal was necessary. So we needed to continue our existence by renewing ourselves, and simultaneously we need to adapt and be dynamic in our approach. But that's only possible with management of resources. That can mean Islamic history, Islamic experience, but my opinion differs from this. I believe that this disregards the experience that we had after the 60s. It means that we need to look at the historical experience with the states, and if we think that the institutions themselves are that represent the religion are religion, then we are at fault. So that's a shortcoming that we need to fix. We need to reference that point, and we need to find we need to renew the way we think, and we need to have we need to go further than imitation in our thought. So we need a new understanding of jihad, which is not just a war on the fronts. It needs to change our life, Islamify our lives all over, with all of its dimensions. This was the third one, and the last one is we need to answer to this challenge with innovation. So we cannot just repeat what we have done in our history. We need to renew our approach. Do we have institutions, opportunities to do that? I don't think the madrasa tradition or the new schools are enough. So there was a new curriculum. We need to create such a curriculum that is going to both preserve our tradition, but it's also going to make us manage or have a bridge to the modern world. That is the only way to do that. We need to have a management of our. We need to manage our manage the resources so that we can fight against oppression. Of course, there are many things that we can say about this, but the main structure is, as I mentioned, this language until 1924 was it was an act of self-defense. It was trying to ensure two things. One was self-preservation, against self-defense against the attacks from external attacks, and we also need to renew and repair the old, and we need to explore the new. And we also, after the First World War, War One, and the occupations of West, there was a stop. And in 1924, there are some acts that turned our civilization's experience, it erased it almost, and Islamic world could not benefit the experiences or knowledge of the ulema, the Islamic scholars. After that, there was an example that told us, Hassan al-Banna mentions it in his memorials. He says that there's a huge challenge that we cannot just solve with staying away from haram. We need to give a response. How do we do that? We need to look at three things. One is we need to look at the traditional ilim, Islamic knowledge, but it shouldn't be a madrasa movement. The second one is the ummah of Islam needs to manage its political action, but it shouldn't be just a street movement like. And the third one is we need to protect the Irfan tradition, but without turning into a cult. So with the leading of ulama cannot take their positions, they cannot continue their roles, so we need to take that role ourselves. I believe this observation is very timely. It's carried Islamic world for 100 years, but it wasn't a permanent approach. No structure, no country could manage this approach for a long term. So when we look at the new world, there have been changing conditions until 1940s with multiple parties. There was some changes in 1980s too, but my observation is we have a new situation here. Islamic movements are in a search of new paradigms. There are some internal conflicts because we need a paradigm change that goes further than individual deficiencies. I believe what has changed. Let's talk about that. I believe the new thing in our postmodern time, we have definitions, postmodernism, post-colonialism, or some other things, which are the lose of truth or losing of hakikat. We can understand different things from this, but in our daily life, we need to have a universal truth. We think that humanity doesn't have a nature. We don't have a truth. There is a belief that one truth is not possible. Sefakay's first sentence after giving a basmala is as I'm saying right now. So every object has its own stagnant nature, and that is knowable. And unchanging truth is knowable. We can access that information. We have such a tradition, and we have such a language, such a discourse. However, the narratives of our modern times say that there is no such truth. There is no such one truth. So everything is individualized in our global world, and we think that human nature doesn't exist, and and we should find common values, and we need to prove the reality of this truth. This should be our first goal. This total individualism results in the fragmentation of the family, or corruption in humanity. So moments we have an approach that focuses on pleasure, and I believe this total subjectivism in some ways keeps us from common values, but in global scale it also keeps us from an authority that we can fight against. The global authority is going more transparent. In the past we knew what we would object against, but right now, as there are multiple enemies, we don't know who is directly challenging us, and we cannot answer this question. We don't have such a concrete authority that we can fight against. And this also separates us from our family, from our culture, civilization, country. People who go to schools, they feel foreign to their own countries. This curricula foreignizes people, and they don't feel spiritual connection to their countries. And there have been scholars that also express that they feel like French people almost. They feel like out of place. They don't feel that they belong to this country with their heart, with their soul, with their mind. And also the digital information resources have been accessible, and they have been diversified, which changed the authority understanding that we have. This is not only a problem, but also an opportunity. If we have a culture that could go ask, do I need to go and take wudu again if my hand bleeds? There was such a dependent understanding, whereas today we can research and learn, but also there is a lack of consensus among the ulama, among the Islamic scholars, and in practicality there's a new discourse, with different schools of thought, different mazhabs in Islam, which creates a huge crisis in Islamic policies. Everyone thinks about Iranians being Persians, being worshipping fire in the past, and 15 years ago there were some heroes that we had. Now they are infidels, they are devils, and they think that we are something else too. So there's this breakage, and we need a language that can fix this separation. Islamic world has a huge crisis that is caused by the injustice in income, and we focus on speculative profits in our productions, and then there's such a global climate and people follow this trend. I can see this with my friends, and so we need to have structures that can produce to meet the needs, to follow the strategies, and instead of those people we have people who focus on making more gain with stocks. So we have a lot of friends that do that. And don't discuss the stock markets being halal or haram. I say that this is not natural. A man of a cause wouldn't do that, shouldn't do that. Any profit that we make without producing is not going to be beneficial. This is a serious problem, and you can see the reflection of different classes, the divides between classes. One person is going to be very poor and another person very rich, and they're going to be brothers. I don't believe it. No one would buy that, and I can't internalize that too. And there's a micro-nationalism wave with the oppression against Syrians. But it is a risk of extremism. And this is because of a nationalist wave too. And we need local, but Islamic language. We need to build a language that is local, domestic, but also Islamic. That both of these aspects should strengthen each other. And until yesterday, Islamic movements were in nation-state level, which caused the problem of failing against a global imperialism. That Ottoman language turned into a party, a political party or a political view instead of an Islamic movement. So it focused on being against the local authorities, and instead of having a language that would address all humanity, it turned into a matter of political parties, and we needed an all-encompassing language, and we are trying to build a relation that is different with that state. We need to look at the level, look at the properties of this relation, and instead of just trusting the authorities, we also need to keep our eggs in different baskets. Any language that expects something from politics instead of producing is not the language of Islam. Islam is a reflection of societal structure, and our societal structure is a representation of our human nature, because some political science, political Islamic approaches focus on expecting everything from the state, but I believe that we should have a relation with the authority, but this relation should be built on reality. We need such a language. We also have another crisis, a huge part of Islamic movements. Islamic movement is a youth movement, but the population is aging very much, and birth rate is also decreasing. Than it's lower than Europe. In Europe it's 1.53, and in Turkey it's 1.51, and the age of getting married is also increasing. It's getting higher, and there are a lot of people breaking up, divorcing, and there are nearly 300 millions of people in the world. They don't live where they were born. They need to immigrate, and 111 million of it, 110 million is forced immigration. We have a reality. We have such a reality. A language that doesn't account for that is not going to be a realistic politics. So we need to look at the changes, the different people that come from other countries we need to, and also seeing Israel as a Jewish country was not truthful, because Israel is a representation, a hub of imperialist system that corrupts our energy to keep us busy. This is a virus that we need to get rid of. This is not a basic topic. We have 100 years of energy, Islamic energy, Al-Gaza with Arabian Spring. I believe I'm a self-disciplined man, but in the last 1 year, I have difficulty with my routines, my interests, my psychology, my work has been ruined by these new things. The same goes for all of the Ummah, and we need to take this problem seriously, and we need to fix it. And finally, I believe we need to remove our intellectual independence too. That doesn't mean we need to separate ourselves from other countries, nor communication, nor relations, but we also need to employ our own people, our own our own resources, human resource, and we need to accreditate people. But the universities are accredited, and people are accredited with the Western standards, but we cannot do that. Why? Not only because of our personal shortcomings, but because there is a non-compatibility with West. So we need to go through, surpass, overcome this intellectual dependence. I believe I talk about Turkey experience, and in Turkey, Muslims have such an approach that I'm going to mention, and we need to criticize this too. We have a pessimistic language. Of course, life continues and everything happens the way they should be. But Turkish Muslims have an experience of working with a lot of we love adventurous people, but we don't follow them. So we want to see the reality. We have such an approach, and there is a serious intellectual discussion happening with Turkey Muslims, not only with limited people, in different organizations, institutions. So we have some common arguments, common proposals. Otherwise, we cannot talk to the public, but that shouldn't fool us. We have people working in the background with a detailed approach. I believe we will have a language that is going to be fully realized in the near future. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vahdettin Hoca. He talked about an encompassing language. He had proposals, and he talked about challenges, and he took the Ottoman experience to the center. It was such an insightful speech. His proposals are very significant for us because the politics should not only be left to the policymakers or the politicians. We need to have a higher morality that is going to lead us, and social relations should lead us. We want to thank him for his presentation. Now we are going to give the microphone to Mehmet Akif. Thank you. I greet you all with love and respect. I'm going to talk about a changing world, and I'm also going to mention a codification of our age. Hopefully it will not bore you out. My question here is, Islam or mainstream Islam does it have an ideal Islamic order understanding that overcomes place or time? So a higher Islamic thinking, does it exist? And in Islam, it's the central question. Do we have such a way of thinking? I want to answer this question in two ways. One claim that I'm going to make, the ideal is political order. When we think about it in global scale, in the common answer here, although there are some exceptions, most of the answers here with the point to liberal democracy. As you know, Huntington talked about it being the third wave, the the democracy of the world, and in that way, democracy after the collapse of socialism and Soviets, this was the best approach. This was the way we saw it.
Dünyadaki bütün şeyler,
all political administrations around the world refer to themselves as democracies, even if they weren't. And in 1990s, this led to another discussion, which was about democracy, because by democracy, what they mean is liberal democracy. So the governments that call themselves democracies were not actually democratic. Farid Zakaria was the one who started this. And today, the dominant discourse on democracy was built that way. So by democracy, what they mean is liberal democracy. So when you add the term liberal to democracy, it's not an easy decision. Adding the term liberal makes it, differentiates it from the Confucian democracy or Islamic democracy, because democracy is the system of modern day, particularly in North America, and it entails a worldview. In continental Europe, liberalism is understood as something different, something between conservatism and democracy. So if we take this as a basis, in fact, when people say democracy, they also refer to the values of a specific system. But is that really the case? Secondly, this is more relevant for us. In Orientalist literature, there is another claim in modern literature. Hamilton Gibbs and many other leading Orientalists and intellectuals from the Islamic world also follow this claim. It says that the mainstream Sunnah worldview has a political stance. What they mean by that is that what we call political theory, or the Sunni political worldview, is a rationalization of the historical developments. So mainstream Sunni Islam tradition is pragmatist, and it does not have a backbone. So that is the claim. So I will try to respond to these two claims. And when doing that, I will try to scrutinize this conceptualization of liberal democracy. And on the other side, I will try to scrutinize that framework we call the Sunni Islam worldview. We need a criterion. The criterion is the human nature. How can we address these claims? How can we understand the liberal democracy or the Islamic worldview on the basis of the human nature? As you know, the main human instinct is survival. So when we say survival, we mean two things. Why? Because the human being is a physical and a spiritual being. So by survival, we mean physical survival, maintaining physical integrity, while also surviving in the spiritual world as well. So maintaining physical integrity requires a political order, a political public order. Why? Because when people come together, because they cannot live alone, they have to come together to survive. And when they come together, there is a risk that they may harm each other. To avoid that, we need a political order. And a political order or a public order aims to preserve physical integrity. And the public order is the hierarchical structure of power, thus ensuring submission. And it creates a monopoly of legitimate violence. As you know, Weber described the modern state this way. The state, the modern state, is a group of people who holds the monopoly of legitimate violence. So what about maintaining moral integrity? That means people living in an environment where they can fulfill their potentials. People living in the conditions in which they can fulfill their potentials. And this entails a public order. But power, monopolization of power is not enough. Monopolized power should also offer the conditions to people to fulfill themselves. So it has to be restricted and contained. So the power has to be monopolized, and at the same time it has to be contained so that it can help people maintain their physical integrity and moral integrity. By today's terms, we also call it equilibrium of security and freedom. So security means people maintaining their physical integrity, and freedom is about people maintaining their moral integrity. And to do that, we need to monopolize power while also containing power. So on the basis of human nature, the vision of a political order that we need requires monopolization of power and containment of power at the same time. When we strip it out of all packaging, this is the main framework that we get. But does this resonate with what happened in history? When we look back at all civilizations in history, we see that this ideal vision of order was all over the place. We don't know how it was implemented in practice, but monopolization of power, a vision of ideal order on the basis of monopolization and containment of power was present in all cultures, and the Tianming culture in China. But before that, I would like to reiterate something. How did they achieve that? In all cultures, we see the common template. The monopolization of power was ensured by seeing the rulers as sacred people. At times when the technology was not advanced, the people had to submit to the rulers, and the rulers had to convince the subjects to submit to themselves, and they could do that only by seeing the rulers as sacred people. They saw themselves as god kings or king gods. But that was not just something pretentious. That was a part of the worldviews in China, in India, in Mesopotamia, and in other parts of the world. We see the same pattern, the same template, just as if they were communicating this to one another. The Tianming belief in China, on one side, it means being a proxy of the God. Rulers are the proxies of God. And also this same Tianming belief contains the power of rulers, because that Tianming is given to the rulers on specific terms. When the rulers fail to fulfill their duties against their people, when they start using oppression, the God withdraws his proxy. One expression of that is the revolutions in China. And also in India, the kings were seen as sons of gods, the Devaputra. So the kings were backed by the god. But still, the power of the king was still contained by the belief of Dharma, Raja Dharma, a moral framework. And when we come to Turan, on one side, they had the Kut belief, And on the other side, they had the Töru concept. So the rulers were sacred, but they were contained by Töru. The same was happening in Mesopotamia. We see the same thing in the laws of Hammurabi. In Egypt, the pharaohs or the godly kings were there, but they also had the Ma'at belief, the daughter of the pharaoh, or the belief of justice. In ancient Greek, in Rome, in the Middle Age Europe, in Latin American civilizations, we see the same pattern reiterating itself. So the concentration of power was ensured by giving sacredness to the rulers, and the containment of power was ensured by a search for justice. All over the world, justice was an element that contained power. So we cannot have a universal definition of justice. We cannot define it by content. We can define it by time. What is justice? Giving everything what they deserve. But we cannot decide who deserves what and how much they deserve it. This worldview, on the basis of this culture and worldview, it is redescribed everywhere. But there is a universal function of justice, that is the containment of power. When we look at the Middle Age Europe, it was the same thing. The rulers, particularly the church, the Pope, they were assigned with sacredness, and their power was contained by a divine framework. This did not change in the modern times. Of course, the discourse was changed, the concepts were changed, but in fact, the essence remained the same. What we call democracy or liberal democracy started in Europe in 16th centuries. It was the ideal order of the modern nation state. But when we look at this process, we see the same pattern. In the 16th century, particularly during the struggles against the church and the Pope, absolutist kingdoms emerged. Their theoretical framework was the divine right of the king to rule. So the kings were the face of the God on earth. So it was absolutist, and they were sovereigns. And sovereignty is a divine quality. It is the authority to decide what is good and beautiful and beneficial. Hobbes was the culmination of this theory. But the theory or the basis was actually suggested by Locke. Locke suggested being able to be contained, so he defined the democracy. So what we call liberal democracy today is the framework that helps rulers concentrate power, while also allows people maintain their moral integrity and fulfill their potentials through the containment of power. So when we talk about liberal democracy and go beyond the packaging and names, we see this same pattern all around the world throughout history. Concentration of power simultaneously with containment of power. This also means something else. Seeing what makes liberal democracy as the ideal governance model is not the basic values, but its ability to address the needs emerging out of human nature. And Islam. Does Islam has an ideal form of order, and does it address the universal needs emerging out of human nature? Just like we did with liberal democracy, let's try to deconstruct this. And we see, when we do that, we see a similar framework. we see what happened in the rest of the world also happened in the Islamic political order as well. For one thing, the Muslims are humans, so you need to address the needs of human nature. As Ibn Haldun mentioned, Emri Shari cannot go against Emri Vujudiye. That's the consensus among Islamic philosophers. How was the concentration of power understood in Islam? I would like to suggest this conceptualization, the concept of Wahdat and Tawhid. What is Wahdat? Wahdat is unity of the Islamic community, the historical continuity, and the guaranteeing of submission of people. And Tawhid is the superiority of law and the realization of justice. Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned this, Nisa 58-59 mentioned this very well. Allah orders you to act in justice. Who does this ayah talk to? The rulers, according to interpreters. You need to entrust goods with those who are capable, and when you rule, you need to rule with justice. So this responds to the second part of our equilibrium, containment of power. Justice contains the power of rulers, and justice is the execution of the principles of Sharia. And the other ayah says, "O people, submit to God, Allah, and submit to those who have been appointed by the Prophet. And if you are oppressed by the rulers, you need to entrust them with Allah. And those who are ruled, they are they are given an order to submit to the rulers. But some interpreters interpret this in a different way. They say this is a conditional assignment. When there's a conflict, the reference point is the Quran and Sunnah. So sovereignty is in Quran and Sunnah, and the ultimate solution is there. So in our equilibrium, this corresponds to the first part, Wahdat, guaranteeing the submission of people. But there is one difference all around the world. The concentration of power was ensured by assigning sacredness to the rulers, and the principle of justice was also considered as a sacred concept. In many cultures, justice is a goddess, Ma'at, Instituya, they are all goddesses. But in our culture, the concentration of power and the containment of power was achieved by law. Since it was against the principle of Tawhid, the rulers were not seen sacred. And a submission was required, and the power was contained by law. The law was the ultimate framework. In addition to Quran, we see the same thing in the Hadith of the Holy Prophet. He encouraged submission, but the submission cannot be in question when rebelling against Allah. There are many details of this Hadith, but I don't want to talk about them because I assume you already know that. In Aqaid texts, also mention this. I'm sure you have seen several of them. In these Aqaid texts, the unity of Allah is defended, but also these texts argue that submission to the political order is very important and required for the continuity of the political order. So the principles, the balance of Wahdat and Tawhid. About containment of power, we need to talk about the principle of Tawhid. In other cultures, the rulers were seen as sacred people, and that led to many abuses of power because who is godlike cannot make any mistakes, so you need to submit to them. And that also brought some abuses. I'm not saying that everyone abused it, but since the belief of Tawhid ended the concept of sacredness assigned to rulers, this also led to some abuse. We did not have such abuses. Of course, there were some mistakes, but because the theory was established that way, it was well implemented. And ontologically speaking, Tawhid contains power, epistemologically contains power, and legally it contains power. So on the level of existence, it contains power. No one can have the will of Allah, cannot be closer to Allah from others than others. No one is closer to the knowledge of Allah more than others. So they cannot use power on the basis of such claims. So the state of law is fundamental. The rulers are subject to law, and this brings equality before law and containment of power. Very recently, while Halak has become very popular, and in his impossible framework, this is explained quite well. I'm wrapping up. When we look at the discussions that entailed Maverdi, Juwayni, Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, and other mainstream ulama, suggested the same balance of Wahdat and Tawhid. For example, in Babel, on one side, the rulers who says power can be legitimized, but their rule was also contained. This is what the Telif meant, actually. Yes, your power is legitimate, but only if you comply with this framework. We see the same thing in others as well, Juwayni, Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah. Maybe the conditions of the time required them to sacrifice the main conditions of Khilafah, but they were insisting on two things: the unity of community, the maslahat of society, and the implementation of the principle of Tawhid and law. And to go back to the questions in the beginning, just as Hamilton and others suggested, the argument that Islam does not have a political ideal order is wrong. A political theory on the basis of Wahdat and Tawhid has always been there. And about liberal democracy, when you take into consideration the present day's conditions, participatory politics is a mandatory thing, not an option. Maybe we should not call it liberal democracy. The political order model suggested by Islam can also address the needs emerging out of the human nature thanks to the principles of Wahdat and Tawhid, because it ensures concentration of power while containing power. Yes, thank you very much. That was the general framework. And if you have any questions, I would like to elaborate. Okay, thank you very much. You offered a very good summary of the topic. I will not try to recap. Anyone who would like to take the floor to share their comments and questions, as long as you don't make a third presentation. Yes, please. Lawyer Dr. Ramazan Atatürk. I am a lecturer. I have a question for Vahdettin, Professor Vahdettin. I carefully listened to your presentation, and thank you very much. And the conclusion I draw from what you said is our existence requires reproducing our own beliefs. So, in the Western practice accumulation before and after our holy prophet. They had the same. They had this ideal or political order, and if that was the case, how can we progress in the future? That means I was not able to explain myself. I don't say we should reject it overtly. Yes, the life is going on as a natural process. In our historical process, we see similar examples like the Greek heritage, the Roman heritage, the Persian heritage, and the Islamic heritage. I believe we need to do the same thing. I like referring to law when I talk about these things. What makes us humans is keşfi kadim, discovering the ancient. After establishing the principles of our identity, we need to establish communication with all parts of the world. Moreover, without you cannot understand the process without getting involved in it, and you cannot understand your law. So you need to participate in it. You need to be involved in it so that you can understand it and establish the nature of your relationship. And those who are involved can benefit from it if they have their principles. Because benefiting from it is inevitable. Said Halim Pasha said, your destiny, humans have to live side by side. In different civilizations, the experiences of humans should be seen and shared. So if you have human nature, you have to be you are able to communicate with everyone, but this is just a matter of competence.
I worked with the changing of the Turkish jurisdiction, and I have studied, and I know the Turkish system, and I know that it has a problem of restructuring, and also the main judges or qadis, they are not qualified, and the way how they're going to be qualified, we have a lack of information in that sense. That's my observation, and in that context, one of the main problems in Islamic world is a lacking in organization and in management. We don't know what should we do and when should we do it, and we have a theoretical problem that is in that same way. Hocam, my Hoca, thank you for your presentation. I'm a lecturer, I'm a faculty member. I listened to Vahdettin Hoca's presentation. He talked about a position that relates to the authorities, that relates to power, but doesn't disregard it either. Of course, it's not very easy. In Turkey, we don't produce intellectuals, but we have a 200-year experience that has the serious intellectual movement after 1970s. We have the West and the East disregards this. Unfortunately, there are some names that disregard and I have my own critiques, I have my own studies, works on that. But because we have a lot of change in Turkey, we look at everything from our current positions. Some of us have opposing language, some of us have the language of narrative of the power, the authority. So we are the language of authority needs to encompass all of the conflicts within us, all of the objections, all of the oppositions. It needs to include it. It needs to be in inclusive language. Without further ado, I would like to hear about our current day, about Akif Hoca. Of course, he talked about many things, but what does Islam suggest about our current life? I have a lot of critiques to his presentation too, but that would be another presentation that I would make, so I will just leave it here. So what I want to say is, before going to other geographies, our own geography is already sufficient, so we don't need to prove ourselves by going past, so we can be more confident about our own geography, and we can express things in that way. Kudret, I agree with the language of authority, a power that we need, just as Kudret Hoca said. With all of our proposals, suggestions, I believe that with our efforts, we need to have an approach that doesn't only puts the political authority in the center. When we look at the body of knowledge in Turkey, I give classes, and when I give those lectures, when I have those classes, in the world, the history doesn't include, disregards Turkey and Ottoman Empire. This is not normal. This is completely not normal. It's abnormal, and I think this shouldn't continue. But of course, there are some things that we can do, and we have done. Reşit Rıza in Istanbul, when he came to Istanbul, he wrote some stuff. He wanted to come to Istanbul. He has a perception of central ulema of Istanbul. He thinks that they know a lot about the Holy Quran, but they don't know about the world. He meets with many people in Istanbul, and after meeting with them in Beyanul Haq, he writes something. He says there are some news about him coming to Istanbul, and a lot of people talk about him in a very positive way, saying that they had a lot of judgments, and the same goes for the person that came to Istanbul as well. So it's a twofold judgment that is incorrectly placed. So both of the parties, when they meet each other, they realize that the way they are is not as presented. So the way we write is also insignificant, because we need to write about ourselves in a way that the world can hear us. These are the things I want to express. I want to thank you for your presentation, Mehmet Akif Hoca. You talked about the concentration of power, and you also mentioned godhood, holiness to the authority, and you mentioned rule of law that is significant, and you exemplified it through many civilizations, and you drew a parallel, and with the theory and practice there are some disparities, some differences when you look at the past with these civilizations or our own experience. Are there any exceptions, or are they because of law, or are they because of the authorities, the power? So what was the determining factor in that sense? Maybe could you go into detail with an example? That would be beneficial. In Islamic political thought, for caliphs, the title is the Khalifatullah, and that's not seen up as appropriate in the main literature. But with Emevi or Abbasi regions, we know that this rule has been disregarded, and those caliphs have taken the title of Khalifatullah, and some poets that try to flatter those caliphs, or in the crisis times, those rulers expressed themselves as guided or chosen by Allah. In Ottoman Empire, Wazirullah title was used, Wazirullah. Of course, there are some discussions if it actually meant that, or in Topkapı Palace, there is a verse, hadith, too. In our culture, in practice, there have been some deviations, but because the theory was sufficient with the Şehir Şah or Melikul Muluk. These are some titles, but the point is not only about the title, but the law and with the approaches to law, with the fiqh books. They talk about who is the judge. Only Allah is the judge. He can only he can build the law. The rulers can do politics, but they cannot object Allah. And the final word is Allah's again, so that maybe clarifies it. In the practice, there have been some deviations, but because of the theory of law being tightly knit, that those deviations are minimized. In other cultures, the theory is not as tightly knit, it's not as strict. There are some limitations, there are some concentrations, but this godhood, godliness has turned this authority very open to being abused or exploited. And now, in our modern times, does the authority have a holiness to it? Yes, in terms of sovereignty, it does. So modern terms are secularized theology terms. Sovereignty, for example, is a term. It determines what is good, what is not, what is right, what is wrong, and as the state, as the representation of public, sees this authority within its own power. Of course, the state is not owned by one person, and there are many heads, many people, which minimizes this abuse, but still there is room for it. I want to thank you for your presentations. I want to ask Vahdettin Hoca, you talked about Islamic movement and you also talked about Islamism. Is every Islamic movement supported by Islamic thought, Islamism, or not? I want to learn about this. Islamism, in my own readings and in my own thoughts, I want to define Said Ali Pasha's definition as a leading person in the process, and with his text produced in that era, I want to take his definition. So we have four main principles in our knowledge system. We need morality, we need a social process, and we also focus on politics. So the second part is integral. Everyone agrees with the first part. The second part, which is very significant, is we need to have a continuous dynamism. We need to reinterpret the way we think about these things, and we need to adapt our lives to that. It's not only a way of only a language, but it's also a way of living. So this framework needs to meet and needs to reshape itself with the needs of the people's lives. For example, with Ottoman Empire or 1950 texts, when we look at them, we see the differences. When we moved on with different political systems, multiple parties, there have been changes. The name of the paradigm is Islamism, but Islamic movements after 1908, the first example, İhvan-ı Müslim with Hasan Ali, and after 1924, the ulema, the rulers, the umara, they were thought of as futile, not necessary, and there was a new movement with a program, with a name. There was a dynamic movement, and it was called Islamic movement. All of the Islamic movements are Islamism. They are supported by Islamism, but Islamism has a variety, a range, a very big range. So the way we do politics has two approaches. That one is changing society through the center, or as Salih Ali Pasha or Akif prefers, we need to update or renew or manage the people, individuals, so going from the bottom to top. So Islamic movements, as I said, from Ihwan, from Cemaat-i Islami, with nationalist view in Turkey, with many examples, we see that ulema and umara have their own mission, and these structures are organized structures that have the same goals, that take up the responsibilities of ulama and umara. They are going to be either restructured, or society is going to take this responsibility to somewhere else. But in Turkey, is Muslims in Turkey are following the discourse of the yesterday, the past, and that is unreasonable in a global world where Islam relates to politics. You talked about a search of new language. We have more than 20,000 words of Quran too. So we have the word intellectual, and we have the munawwar word for it. So we have words that actually mean a lot of things, but we don't put a lot of emphasis on them. Don't they deserve their rightful place? That's what my question. Of course, they have their rightful place, but I follow Babanzadeh in terms of language. He, in Ilmun Nefis, in his Mukaddimah, he says, if a word has its equivalent, we need to use it. If it doesn't have its own equivalent, but we can produce it, we need to produce it, reproduce it with a new word. But if we don't have it, for example, secularism doesn't have its Turkish counterparts, or so Islam can use secularism and its own word similarly in Turkish, in other languages as well. So because we don't have its counterpart in Turkish. But of course, I don't have a strict stance on this. Would you like to say some words? I want to thank you all for your patience, for your contributions. Now we will end the session here. But before the guests leave, we will have our vice chairman to present his gifts to our speakers. He is the Istanbul representative.